Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here and to see all of you. I'm honored that you asked me to give a talk today, and thank you for letting me go before Dom. Um, Following Dom is never easy, so thanks for letting me go first. And you did remind me that I should acknowledge that I'm giving this talk on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation um, in Canada here. So again, without further ado, I'm happy to be here today to take you on a journey through my research, both past and present, which is also a nice segue into my talk today. I'm going to start the talk a little bit differently than normal with a song. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing, but I am going to weigh into an area that I probably have no place being, and that being Australian history. As some of you in this virtual room know, I have a rather unhealthy love for Australia. Um, so I'm going to start with your unofficial national anthem, that being Waltzing Matilda. Now, why am I mentioning Waltzing Matilda? I'm mentioning it because the song references the sheep herders strike in, I believe it was 1894. Some of you might correct me if I'm wrong. But basically, the sheep shearers were rebelling against the British class system. And such a song is not uncommon. It's nation building through story. And in this case, story put to music. After all, what is a group without its stories, the telling and retelling of group tragedies and its triumphs? They are the building blocks of every social group. They're the building blocks of social identity. Think of each story as a log in a Jenga tower. I'm sure that all of you are familiar with the game if you haven't played it yourself, but the tower doesn't exist without the logs, like a group does not exist without its stories. Why are stories so important for social identity? Because they inform members who they are, where they came from, and where they are going. But unfortunately, modernity has fueled a sense of loss and change that has created a disconnection with the past. And if we want to put this into psychological terms, groups feel a sense of what's called collective discontinuity, a discontinuity with their past, with their group's essence, losing what it means to be, for example, an Australian, or as we'll see today, the research that I'm going to present to you, what it means to be, say, a French Canadian or an American. But if you'll permit me, I'm going to go back to the idea of the Jenga tower. And akin to playing the game Jenga, many group members perceive that that collective discontinuity, they perceive collective discontinuity in a manner similar to the blocks from a Jenga tower if they are removed. After all, what happens when too many blocks are removed? The tower falls. Okay. And group members are motivated to ensure that their group doesn't fall. So I want to make this a little bit more concrete before we go forward. This is a story that I've told and retold many times during talks, but I would imagine that this is something that you're unfamiliar with. It's the town of Arrowville, Quebec. First, I should say that in Quebec, French Canadians are notoriously concerned for their identity, the future vitality of the French language, the French culture. And some communities have taken extreme action in this regard. The town of Arrowville, well, now it's almost 10 years back, they were very concerned about the future vitality of the French language, and they passed what they called the Declaration of Norms. So this was a code of conduct that people who came to the town and lived in the town, among other things, weren't allowed to carry weapons to school. Even ceremonial weaponry weren't allowed to cover one's face in public. In the Declaration of Norms, you were no longer, I guess, allowed to kill women by stoning them in public, burning them alive. What what this was getting at was a concern about immigrants and what it might do to the future of the French Canadian language and culture. Now, what's important to know about this situation is that at the time that they passed this declaration, there was not a single non-French Canadian living in Arrowville, nor was there a single non-French Canadian planning to move to Arrowville. Okay, so this was all in the mind's eye. And as I like to tell my students, that in psychology, we don't necessarily study reality, we study the perception of reality. And so over the past decade, I've been examining a group-based emotion that stems from perceived existential threats to the group's future vitality, what we've called collective angst, or the concern for the group's future vitality. Importantly, the emotional goal of collective angst is to protect the in-group's future. And so what we have shown, and others have shown over the last, over a decade of research on this topic, is that the goal is to protect the group's future, but this can take on many different forms, constructive or pro-social forms, but also destructive or anti-social forms. So for example, when group members feel collective angst, that we've witnessed an increase in anti-immigration sentiments, desire for social distance, conspiracy theorizing, but on the, one would say, more pro-social end, we see progressive collective action, willingness to compromise when people feel collective angst. Now, what has bothered me over the years is what directs people to act in one way or the other when facing collective angst. And this is where my research has been over the last number of years. My colleagues and I have argued that collective angst, again, concern for the group's future, when people feel collective angst, that it turns group members towards the in-group's past. Now remember, the human mind is a master time traveler. We can project ourselves into the future, and when the future is perceived to be under threat, group members find grounding, they find comfort in the treasured past of their in-group. And I think this is nicely illustrated by the slide that I hope all of you are seeing right now, that we protect the in-group's future. One way to, when we feel that the in-group's future is under threat, to protect the in-group's future, we try to preserve the in-group's past, a perceived better past when the group enjoyed better times. Put simply, group members nostalgize. And what is nostalgia? It's an emotion that reflects a sentimental longing for the group's past. When group members believe that the current, say, social, cultural, political realities have placed the stability of their group in flux, they often experience collective nostalgia. Importantly, nostalgia is functional. It's a coping mechanism. It allows group members to focus on what aspects of the group are important and thus what needs to be protected in the face of existential threat. So if I can kind of sum up this hypothesis that we've been working with, is that existential threat should elicit collective angst, which leads people, group members, to nostalgize about the group's past, which then directs behavior. Now, before I jump into some of the studies, I need to underscore a point. You might be asking yourself, well, wait a second. So is Michael saying that one emotion leads to another? And that's precisely what I'm saying, that this is actually a lost aspect or an understudied aspect of intergroup emotions theory. So Iran Halprin, for example, showed that hate on its own isn't going to lead to aggressive behavior towards an outgroup. It's hate in combination with an event that angers the group. So it's a combination of anger and hate that leads to violence and aggression. And then in emotions literature at the interpersonal level, that people have argued that that emotions can either occur simultaneously or sequentially. And so we predicted that angst should lead to nostalgia, which then directs groups' behavior. And the first foray into this, we tested this hypothesis with the aid of data from 27 countries that the one and only Yolanda Yutton brought people together from 27 countries to complete a battery of questionnaires in these 27 countries. And among those questions that were in that larger survey were questions about collective angst, collective nostalgia, and various in-group protective behaviors and perceptions towards outgroups. And what we found is that in line with our hypothesis that collective angst led to collective nostalgia, and that this collective nostalgia is what ended up leading to constructive, you could argue constructive behaviors, so increased sense of belonging, but also destructive behaviors, opposition to immigration. Now, again, there's some messiness here, right? We still haven't figured out what leads group members to support constructive versus destructive outcomes. We see both constructive and destructive outcomes here. And this is where, and once again, I need to thank Yolanda for putting me in touch with Anouk Smeeks, and we started talking about this issue. And one of the things that I had mentioned to her is that what bugs me about the current nostalgia literature is that we measure it with items such as, I feel nostalgic for the group's past. What we don't ask people is, what are you nostalgizing for? We don't ask group members the content of the nostalgic reverie. And why is that important? It's important because collective memories, which are at the heart of nostalgizing, are social constructions, right? They're typically constructed to make us feel good about our group's present, our past, and our future. When I grew up, and there's some Canadians in this room, you may have experienced the same thing when you grew up. When I grew up, we learned that Euro-Canadians helped bring civilization to the Indigenous population, and this was celebrated. This, of course, was a social construction, one that thankfully has shifted with time. However, it's entirely possible that that narrative could have a resurgence. Why? Because our understanding about history is easily manipulated, especially when groups feel that they are under threat. So much of my current research focuses on understanding collective nostalgia and its manifestations. Specifically, my colleagues and I have argued that to understand the effects of angst-induced nostalgia, we need to come to terms with the idea that not all nostalgizing is the same. After all, nostalgia is often the product of retrospective mythologizing about the in-group's past. Some nostalgia, some group members might nostalgize about a time when the group was more open to other cultures and might be more open to ethnic diversity, if it ever really was. And here we have Obama. Obama made many kind of nostalgic-esque speeches where he tried to bring to mind that that the United States was a nation of immigrants and that it was in our bones. Other group members might nostalgize for a time when the group was more homogeneous, if it ever was. And let's not dwell on Trump and try to move past, but oh, you know, a lot of his rhetoric was a dog whistle to a past that was dominated by, you know, white men. So we hypothesized that the content of nostalgia matters. And in the first study, we examined two possible contents that matter. Openness-focused, what we called openness-focused nostalgia, and homogeneity-focused nostalgia. But there are likely others. For the sake of time, I'm going to tell you right now about two initial studies, one with a sample of MTurk participants and one with a nationally representative sample of Poles. Then we were able to verify the presence of these two different types of nostalgizing and that they are empirically distinguishable. And also in line with hypotheses, whereas openness-focused nostalgia predicted support for immigration, homogeneity-focused nostalgia predicted opposition to immigration as well as anti-Muslim sentiments. And in the capstone study, we wanted to see if we could manipulate. One of our arguments is that leaders try to manipulate the nostalgizing of the populace. And can we do that? Can we ask people to think about an America that was more open to other cultures and religions, or an America that was more culturally and religiously homogeneous? And then we had participants complete the anti-immigration scale and an anti-Muslim prejudice scale. And in line with hypotheses, sorry if this is small on some people's screens, but openness-focused nostalgia led to, or sorry, the openness manipulation led to an openness-focused nostalgia and a decrease in anti-Muslim prejudice. Whereas conversely, the homogeneity-focused led to nostalgizing about when the group was very similar, and that increased Muslim prejudice. And likewise for anti-immigration prejudice. So to keep rolling, after that study, but also during the time that we were thinking about all this, we started, and when we were diving into the nostalgia literature, we noted something really, what we thought was really interesting, is that nostalgia is typically framed as a conservative emotion. Okay, why? Because at least on the surface, this characterization kind of makes sense, because central to conservatism is a positive evaluation of the past, a valuing of the past status quo, and a corresponding desire to keep things as they were. And that conservative philosophers believe that the past has intrinsic value and should be respected. In fact, some have even characterized conservative political philosophy as a politics of nostalgia. Now, is this the case? Or is it simply that the content of the nostalgia that tends to be in focus when in the traditional nostalgia literature? And we argued that that liberals, both liberals and conservatives, nostalgize just for different things. And so we conducted 3 different studies MTORC workers, Canadian students, and quite a large sample of English participants through Prolific. And we had them to complete the openness focused nostalgia scale, the homogeneity focused nostalgia scale, and then a bunch of scales that assessed intergroup attitudes. And what we found, in line with our hypotheses, again, of course, because it was published, so it was in line with our hypotheses, but I digress. Conservatives were more likely to express homogeneity-focused nostalgia, and liberals were more likely to express openness-focused nostalgia. What's also important to show you here is that there was no main effect of collective nostalgia. So there was no difference in the amount of collective nostalgia that liberals and conservatives felt. It's only the type of nostalgia that they felt that differed. And we replicated this effect in 2 other studies. I will say that we do see that there is a slight main effect for nostalgizing in study 2, but I don't want to spend all that much time on it, because if you remember in the previous slide, it was underpowered. It was woefully underpowered. We'd hoped to collect more data from the student sample, but then the school year ended and we needed to submit the paper for publication. So it was underpowered. But in line with our hypotheses, we did a Minimeta, and what we found is that liberals were more likely to experience this openness-focused nostalgia, which ended up leading to a decrease in intergroup prejudice, whereas conservatives were more likely to experience the homogeneity-focused nostalgia, and that was positively associated with intergroup prejudice. So now that we have that base, we wanted to take this knowledge that we had about collective nostalgia, and we want to assess it in the real world. We want to take it out into the out of the laboratory into the real world. And we asked ourselves, could framing certain aspects of intergroup history as being a positive impact, the type of collective nostalgizing that people will experience will in turn perhaps increase or reduce intergroup prejudice. And so I'll take absolutely zero credit for this study. This study is really the hard work of a postdoc that's working in my lab, Anya Stefaniak, who for the last number of years has been running an intervention in Poland called the School of Dialogue. And there's 4 workshops, and they take polls to this workshop that's focused on local history and mutual heritage. They learn about the history of the Jewish minority in their place of residence, and they learn about Polish history and how the groups used to live side by side and get along. And this is so we conducted a longitudinal study, and what's important is that at no time during the School of Dialogue is nostalgia even mentioned, okay? It's just a discussion about Polish history and the past with the Jewish minority. So in one of these more recent interventions, we included our measures of openness-focused nostalgia, homogeneity-focused nostalgia, and some other measures. And we looked here, hopefully this is large enough for you to see on your screen. What we see is that the intervention increased openness-focused nostalgia, it decreased homogeneity-focused nostalgia, increased knowledge, which is good because that was the whole point of the intervention, and increased knowledge or interest in history. But when it came to attitudes towards Jews, only the openness-focused nostalgia was a significant mediator. So the intervention increased openness-focused nostalgia, and it was the openness-focused nostalgia that ended up improving attitudes towards Jews. When it comes to attitudes towards diversity, we see that the effect of the intervention goes through openness-focused nostalgia as well as interest in history. So what are the implications of that particular study? I think what's important is that collective nostalgia is not simply a means to buttress the in-group or motivate group members to derogate or distance themselves from the out-group, which is how collective nostalgia has typically been framed, and that that nostalgia leads to bad intergroup outcomes. Teaching about history and coexistence with ethnic groups can increase openness-focused nostalgia, and we see that that can have a positive effect on intergroup attitudes. And so the take-home message with that particular study, I think, is that history can be used, right? It can be used for good. Okay. Now, in the last about 5 or so minutes that I have left in my talk, I'm going to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about, because thus far we've examined how nostalgia influences attitudes towards the out-group. And what I want to do now is turn our attention to the in-group and whether one type of existential threat may yield nostalgia that is reflected in an anxiety that the group is being pulled apart, okay, being pulled apart at the seams. Now, the rise of polarization over the last 25 years, particularly in the US, is troublesome, okay? And that many Americans are worried about this state of politics that's going on right now. This worry is understandable. Because up to a point, polarization can help democracies, but when it becomes too vast, such that the entire swath of a population refuses to even consider the other side's point of view, this can thwart the democratic methods for solving societal problems. To the point, polarization may undermine the future vitality of one's nation state, so collective angst. Now, on January 6th, in the middle of this insurrection, Dom Packer, some of you may know him. I don't know if any of you have ever, seen that chap before, maybe in this virtual room here. But Dom and I not only commiserated about what we were witnessing, we began chatting about our concerns about political polarization and whether these concerns might be at the heart of the kind of support that we were witnessing for Trump, as well as strong leaders in general. And so we decided that we should collect some data in the aftermath of the insurrection. And credit goes to Dom for putting together an ethics proposal and then submitting it, and Lehigh giving us approval so quickly. And we included measures of concern for about polarization, nostalgia, and support for strong leaders. Now, you might ask, why nostalgia? Well, because the electorate that yearns for a strong leader typically longs for the leader to restore order and bring back the unified glories of the past. We had hoped to get a large sample of both Trump and Biden voters to assess both sides' concerns and the nostalgia from both sides. But at the end of the day, we didn't get a sufficient number of Trump voters in the sample from Prolific. But what's important is that the data that I'm going to show you political orientation did not seem to influence the relations that I'm going to show you. So again, we predicted that concern about polarization would lead to support for a strong leader. And we had a couple of different hypotheses about what might happen. We thought that concern about polarization might lead some group members to hypothesize about, or to nostalgize about, a more homogeneous America. And I don't need to go through that because we've already talked about it. And that it's that homogeneity focused nostalgia that would lead to support for a strong leader. We also thought about, well, what about maybe concerns about polarization might also lead to more of this, what we are calling civic civility focused nostalgia. And that is longing for a time when the democracy worked and that people put a greater value on democracy, and that that kind of longing might also lead to support for a strong leader, but a strong leader that would kind of rally the troops, right, and bring us back to a time where we could where we were unified. Surprisingly, I mean, we did see the direct effect of concern about polarization to support for a strong leader, but it didn't affect homogeneity focused nostalgia, and there was no indirect effect. What we saw is that concern about polarization increased this civic civility focused nostalgia. And that is what, when you had that kind of, when you were nostalgizing in that way, that's what led to support for a strong leader. Now, what I will say is that one of the things that Dom and I have been talking about over the last few weeks, or I guess month now, is that akin to the nostalgia measure that I said that it was really messy because we weren't the literature didn't look at what people were nostalgizing for. I think a lot of the literature on support for a strong leader is also messy because they're not testing necessarily what kind of strong leader they're looking for, right? That I think that typically people are thinking about the support for a strong leader measure as sort of this unconstrained authority, right? Someone who is most concerned about agency and security might be more interested in a leader who will consolidate their executive authority to get things done. But there's also a strong leader that's a unifying force kind of strong leader, right? Someone who's most concerned about bringing the group together. And so we do have data in the hopper that I think that we're going to be getting to maybe tomorrow, the weekend, next week. Dom got sidetracked because he needed to submit his book that he just submitted, so kudos. But we'll probably be getting to that soon enough. What I want to underscore is that these data suggest various forms of populism, perhaps, and it can be argued that these are very dangerous times for democracy. Russia, Turkey, Poland, Hungary, countries that once offered democratic hope are now in varying degrees falling into authoritarianism. And what's at the heart of this? Well, I would argue that different types of collective nostalgia might be relatively easy to stimulate by political leaders who portray the groups to be facing an existential threat, whether it be by immigrants, political elites, and by portraying the group's past as unequivocally positive and promising that they are the ones to be able to bring back the past, that this can galvanize the electorate to support these kind of populist leaders. And I'm going to end the talk with this slide. And what should you be taking away from this talk? It's that the stories we tell matter, because those stories can and have been used to galvanize the group. in good times, but especially in bad. I really love this quote that the universe is made of stories, not atoms. And I would say that the group is made of stories, not atoms. One's identity is made up of stories, not atoms. Um, and what to take away from this talk as well is nostalgia good or bad? Um, Rationalists have typically disparaged it as clouding our critical judgment. It's often it's often just a bunch of historical inaccuracies, and the manner in which it can and has been exploited for political rhetoric is a source of concern. But I feel, and I think that some of my data show, an equivocal evaluation is in order. Right? Its implications should not be prejudged as being conservative or regressive. Many noble causes have been sustained on longing for a better future based on the past. Our data in Poland suggests that it can yield pro-diversity effects. What I'll say is that at the end of the day, the content of nostalgia matters. And I think that those who study intergroup emotions, we need to start looking at the content of the emotion, that there's predictive utility there. What are people nostalgizing about? What are people feeling angry about? What are people feeling angst about? That can lead us down the road to greater understanding of socio-political realities and their consequences. So with that, I'll thank members of the team that have been involved in this research, and Shirk for supporting this. And thank you very much again for your time and inviting me here today.